Yes, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the sunrise session. As John has said, I'm very, very proud to be here as British Musicians Union's General Secretary-elect. And I'm sure that you will have ahead of you a lovely, absorbing, informative and entertaining session to keep you awake. If any of you do decide to grab 40 winks, that's fine, just don't snore, please. So, first of all, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. I'm particularly interested in this subject, and it's something that I kind of have two people in my head which argue both sides of the coin on this one. But I think we're going to also hear different issues and different aspects of this topic and different opinions on it. So it should be quite lively, and I look forward to hearing questions from the floor when we get there. So first of all, on my far right is Torbjørn Eide. I got there, good. And Torbjørn's a double bass player from the Bergen Philharmonic Orchestra. He's an active union rep and has also been a musician rep on the orchestra board, so he's particularly pertinent to this topic. Next to Torbjørn is Thérèse Boutin. Now, Thérèse is not a musician. Thérèse is a seasoned manager and specialist in governance on non-profit organisations. She's a senior executive in Quebec and Ontario, or has been, in culture, media, education, public administration sectors. So I think Thérèse is going to talk specifically about governance and what is good governance. Next to Thérèse is Bongani Tembe, and Bongani is a tenor, a singer of international renown, and has been chief executive and artistic director of the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra from Durban. He's also been appointed chief executive of the Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra. So 2 jobs then. And interestingly enough, Naomi, you've got 2 jobs too, haven't you? This is Naomi Bensdorf-Frisch, and she's an executive board member of ROPA, which is the Regional Orchestra Players Association in the US. She's a principal oboe, Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. And as I say, she has 2 jobs because she's also in the Illinois Philharmonic Orchestra. And she's very actively involved with the AFM in the US. Okay, so musicians on boards, governing boards. Is it a good idea? What is good governance? How does it affect the bargaining unit? This is the thing that I suppose concerns me most as a trade union official. Where does it leave the bargaining unit? How does it leave you with your relationship with your colleagues? How does that change? We all know that it changes. We all know that some of your colleagues will look at you sideways when you go onto the Board of Governors. Is there training required? Should any musician who takes up that position get training for it? Do they need to be inducted? What processes need to be followed to make sure that the whole relationship works well? And where do you draw the line? I mean, do you talk about capability procedures? Do you talk about performance reviews? It's very difficult when it's your colleagues that you're talking about. And orchestra numbers, that's another thing. I mean, in the UK, it's something that we wrestle with all the time. Too many empty seats being filled by deps and extras instead of permanent players. Sometimes it's cheaper for the orchestra to do it that way. Sometimes it's not. But, you know, what part do you play in those discussions? Because you have to really devote your full attention to the financial and administrative side of the band, not just the artistic side. Okay, well, those are some of the things that I think that we ought to try and cover in this session. But I'm going to start with probably the person who has most experience of being on an orchestra board. I'm going to start with Torbjørn. So if you'd like to just, I'm going to be quite strict, Torbjørn, because yesterday I think it got away from us a little bit at times. And so if I see you going on and on, I'm going to stop you.
That's good. That's good. Is the
Thanks very
microphone
much.
working? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Horace, and thank you, FIM, for organizing this conference. And first of all, I want to say something about my orchestra, my workplace, the Bergen Philharmonic Orchestra. The BPO is one of 2 national orchestras in Norway. We count 101 musicians, and the orchestra has a history dating back all the way to 1765, which makes the orchestra one of the world's oldest. The family of Edvard Grieg had a close connection with the orchestra. In 1770, the great-grandfather of the composer was hired as a concertmaster, and in 1880, Edvard Grieg himself became the orchestra's artistic director. After his death, he donated his assets to the orchestra, organized as a fund, and it has since then made a considerable contribution to the orchestra. The Bergen Philharmonic Orchestra has since 1995 been organized as a foundation and is fully financed by the Norwegian government, which in fact means that the basic funding is guaranteed, but in order to be able to fulfill our strategic plans, we also depend on private sponsoring. Okay, and then the board. The orchestra's board consists of 8 members, 4 picked by the government, amongst them the chairman. And the musicians have 2 positions, and the last 2 is for the supporters and the administration of the orchestra's fund. The government representatives are elected for 4 years, the other for 2 years at a time. When you, as a musician, untrained for board work, enter the boardroom for the first time, you're easily overwhelmed and maybe a little intimidated by the experience and the board smartness from many of the board members. In fact, it resembles a little bit of this situation. The other members of the boards are most likely lawyers, politicians, or business people, and they all have tons of experience from sitting in several boards. But only after a short time, one will often see that these people are genuinely interested in the arts in general and music in particular, and most often have a great respect for our profession. For that reason, we are being noticed and listened to. Being a board member and a union representative for your fellow musicians is in many ways 2 different things. I guess many of us have been in a situation where we have been silenced by the board chairman, accused for doing union work at a board meeting. If it happens too many times, you probably feel that you're more influential as a union official in your negotiations with the management than as a board member. So is our participation in the orchestra boards merely window dressing? I mean, absolutely not, but just think about it. As a board member, you're in fact your boss's boss. What a fantastic thought. It is in fact the board that hires and sacks the managers and who gives the and they monitors the manager's execution of his work, or hers. It may be another and more subtle influence, and it's definitely more about the longer and wider perspective. Here we are able to influence on budgets and strategies. And when it comes to strategy planning, our orchestra try to involve as many of the musicians' committees as possible together with the board. And I have to say that the board try not to do any artistic decisions now. The way our board usually works, it will always try to reach a consensus. This will, of course, result in a good discussion, maybe. But the downside of it is, of course, that even if you don't fully agree with the rest of the board on some of these matters, you will be held accountable for it. It is a dilemma to be both a union representative and a board member at the same time. And is it a danger that our representatives can be too much manager-like in their way of thinking? The danger is there, perhaps. I have not quite concluded on this matter, but it will be interesting to hear other views and experience on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Torbjørn. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to not do things in the natural order. I'm going to go to Naomi now and ask her to tell you all about her experience.
You surprised me. Okay. Is this all right? Is this on?
Can you hear? Yeah?
Okay. All right. So I'm here representing ROPA, which is an organization of 85 orchestras across the United States. We represent 7,000 orchestral musicians across the country. And an interesting thing about ROPA is that we represent a very wide variety of orchestra sizes and budgets and styles as well. We have chamber orchestras, we have ballet and opera orchestras, we have full symphony orchestras, we have orchestras that follow the core model where they have a very small core of full-time players and fill out with additional players. And our budgets run from less than $500,000 all the way up to tens of millions of dollars. So when we come together every year for our annual conference, it can sometimes be challenging to come together and find, topics. I mean, obviously there are things that we want to discuss and that we help each other and support each other with. But one thing that I find that unifies all of us is that consistently in all of our orchestras, the ones where the musicians and the board members have a good relationship are the orchestras that are thriving. So it's something that we try to promote, is this open, trusting, transparent relationship between boards and musicians. That being said, we, sort of what Torbjørn was talking about, we don't necessarily think that musicians actually serving on the board is the best way to accomplish that kind of relationship because of all the potential conflicts that could happen. You mentioned financial issues, union conflicts, there's all kinds of potential issues. And so I thought I would share an example of a typical situation to sort of illustrate our point. And that example is, it's very common, I think, in many of our contracts to give musicians access to the stage a certain number of minutes before a concert. In my orchestra in Illinois, we have a clause that says something like, management shall make its best efforts to give musicians stage access 45 minutes before the concert. We can have a whole nother discussion about what best efforts means, but. So I imagine a scenario where you have a musician who's serving as a board member, and there's a board meeting, and there's a discussion about, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had this pre-concert cocktail hour, and we could take our VIPs backstage, and we could show them, everything that's going on, and it would be, such a great way to raise money for the orchestra and to increase our visibility. And the musician is involved in this conversation, and they're saying, oh, yeah, this is great, and, we could have, musicians could be available to meet with, I could be available to meet with these VIPs. And then someone in the board says, oh, well, we wouldn't want it to be too early before the concert because, then what would they do for 45 minutes? So musician on the board, it's okay if we just, make it run until 20 minutes before the concert, right? So that musician is then placed in a really, really difficult position because as a representative of the musicians, they have a duty to represent the wishes of the musicians, to represent the union appropriately. But they also have a duty as in their board role to, be a team player and to cooperate. So it puts them in a really awkward position. And instead, I think that these conversations can happen in a setting apart from the traditional boardroom that can facilitate these kinds of great relationships without creating this conflict. And we've done this throughout our Europa orchestras in a variety of ways. I talked to some of our delegates from across the country before I came here. In Ann Arbor, they have, I think, 2 musicians who are non-voting members. They come to the board meetings, they're invited to the public portions of the board meetings. They have a great relationship with the board and with their managers. And through being available and being able to do this, they were able to create a lot of community partnership programs and grow the visibility of the orchestra. It's also similar situations. I've worked in Mississippi Symphony and in the Huntsville Symphony. And I'll talk, because I know them the best, a little bit about my 2 orchestras. In the Illinois Philharmonic, we do not have musicians serving on the board. We used to. And as kills it in many places, we had a particularly contentious labor negotiation, and that was the end of our musician representative on the board. And that happened, many of you heard about Hartford last year. Hartford is one of our orchestras as well, and that was a similar situation there. But since that particular contentious labor negotiation, we've really worked hard to recreate those relationships between the musicians and the boards. We've had thankfully our new executive director has made an effort to invite musicians to social events that involve board members. That's opened the lines of communication and created, a better environment for discussion. And as we've grown away from this contentious labor negotiation, the relationship with the board has assisted in some growth, very little, but some. And in my other orchestra in Wisconsin, we had a strike in 2008, and it was a really tough situation. And I can't tell you, I've been in that orchestra for 14 years now, and we have never once been asked to participate in the board in that orchestra directly. It's always been the board has always been very separated from us as musicians. And prior to our most recent negotiation in 2014, the board reached out to us. It's kind of a long story, but we ended up creating a labor management committee. And we met once a month with musicians, members of the board, and the music director and the executive director, just to talk about issues that were coming up in the orchestra. And the result of those labor management committee sessions was that when we did go into negotiations, we were able to get through it in about 3 months with no problems and get a great settlement. So to sum up, it's extremely important that musicians and board members can communicate and have trust and can work together. But there are a number of issues that I believe prevent or should prevent musicians from actually serving on boards.
Thank you. Well, come on now. Okay, yeah, I'm going to ask Bongani, just as you put the microphone down, pick it back up again, to give his perspective on this now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Horace, and thank you for FIM. I'm saying this on behalf of the few managers in the room. So I think this is a very important platform, and what FIM is doing is great. I'm going to try and address this question in terms of my own experiences. So I'm going to put it in the context of my experiences and that of my country, South Africa. We all know the history of South Africa. In 1994, President Mandela became the first democratically elected president in South Africa, and South Africa has never been the same. So whilst that was great, it ushered a new era, but also there were challenges because society was changing. Now, before 1994, the government, almost all the funding for the arts from government went to 4 performing arts councils in Cape Town, Durban, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein. and those were mostly white institutions with their own orchestras and ballet companies. So when the new government came in, it said, yeah, no, we like the orchestras and ballets, but we want to level the playing field. Jazz musicians, contemporary dance companies should also have access to the arts. So it said the performing arts councils now will no longer own their own orchestras. The orchestras must be independent and have independent boards, and they fend for funding just like any other company. In other words, their funding was no longer guaranteed. Before, orchestras didn't have to fundraise or anything like that. It just came straight from government. So this was obviously a huge challenge in South Africa. And I just arrived in the country in 1994, and I joined the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra in Durban. And of course, you know, we then basically had to start a new orchestra. So I drafted the terms, the articles of association of the orchestra, worked very closely with the musicians then. It was a good time because myself and the musicians chose the new board, we did the whole thing. And so we agreed that we'll have one orchestra member in the board, and that the orchestra could also choose any other person out there to be part of the board of about, say, 9 people. Now, part of our great relationship with the orchestra was that I was completely transparent about things. If there's $1,500 in the account, I tell them. So, and I found that musicians don't mind the bad news. They just want to know exactly what is happening. Mm. So this promoted trust and things like that. And things went well in the beginning as far as this matter of an orchestra representative. But like all other things, there are pluses and minuses. When you've got an orchestra representative, it promotes trust and communication between musicians and the board, but there are also pitfalls as highlighted just now. But I'm going to go to the heart of this issue. We all know what is the role of a board, right? It is to support the mission and vision of the orchestra, is to ensure that there is good corporate governance and ethics, because you can have a great mission and vision. If ethics are not good, everything falls apart. It has to, even though the board does not get directly involved in artistic matters, it has to ensure that there is excellence and artistic integrity, and that it is relevant or serves the community. And that's a big topic, but we won't get to today. So now, if a musician is part of the board, it means also this is their role. Now, here is the potential conflict in all of this, is that every board member has a fiduciary duty to the orchestra company, not necessarily to the musicians. That's where the tension lies here. So if the musician is in the board, is their job simply to just carry the views of the musicians to the board, and then vice versa, go to the musicians and say, the board says this, or they need also to have some courage. Now, we had a problem with our member of the board, and if you want to call it a problem, I call it a problem. I'll tell you why. Because if the musicians say, we want 30%, it goes to the board and say, we want 30% increase. If the board says, where is this money going to come from? It says, I don't know, that's your job, but we demand 30%. And often that's not very helpful. I still think that it's a good thing on the overall to have a musician or musicians in the orchestra board, but a lot depends on who that person is, and also all the parties understanding their roles here. Because an executive is also part of a board, but his fiduciary duties to the company, you know, and so often the interests of the executive may not always align with the greater interests of the company, similarly of musicians. We have to accept that. So I rather have a musician who is courageous, who is going to be able to tell musicians and say, guys, I sit on this board, I've analyzed all the financials, and I can tell you that the company cannot afford 30%. So let's look at 15 and maybe peg it the next year to 20. You know, other than just being a conduit and not really using their access to information at the board. Now I realize that then they've got a very difficult conversation with the orchestra, but it's necessary. You know, you should say, here's our budget. 70% of this budget or so, or whatever percentage, goes to our salaries. Now, if we give a 30% increase, we'll have absolutely no money for artistic performances or community outreach. Then people will say, what is the orchestra doing then? So, and really explain this to musicians and be an effective bridge between musicians and the board. So that's a potential pitfall. The other lesson where we, I think, made a mistake, our articles simply say musicians shall choose one of their own to represent them in the board, right? So musicians, therefore, would just get together once a year or 3 years and choose an orchestra representative. But that person may not be part of the orchestra committee or union because that's a different process. So that creates an anomaly because this person is sitting on the board, is saying the orchestra says this, and the orchestra union representative or orchestra committee is saying different things. So I think if there is going to be a musician in the board, it's important that they are part of the leadership of the union or orchestra committee. So again, this is really the overall good of the company. We must always be conscious of the fact that at the end, it's about music. It's not about management. I'm sorry, as important as musicians are, it's not only about the musicians. Of course, there is no orchestra without musicians. Like there is no bar without liquor. So that's clear. But at the end of the day, is the company sustainable? Is it able to serve the community? And that tension is always there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our final panelist, Thérèse Boutin, over to you.
Merci. Alors moi, je vais m'adresser à vous dans les 2 langues officielles de mon pays, puisque je représente le Canada ici aujourd'hui. Oui, je vais vous laisser le temps de mettre vos écouteurs. Je suis très, très honorée d'être ici aujourd'hui comme représentante du secteur de la gestion des orchestres, en fait, et de la gestion des arts. Moi, j'ai un énorme respect pour les musiciens avec qui j'ai travaillé pendant de très, très nombreuses années et de pouvoir m'adresser à vous aujourd'hui sur une question qui est très complexe. Ça me fait énormément plaisir. The question at hand here is difficult to answer, and it's important to have a good look at the elephant in the room. And that elephant is governance, good governance. It's also important to understand the prerequisites of governance, which are transparency, ethics, like my friend here, Bongani, mentioned a little while ago, accountability, and then again, responsibility. Let's start by defining governance as it pertains to not-for-profit organizations, such as orchestras. The issue of governance has been front row center of all those concerned around the world, actually, for the last 15 years or so. It found its source in the Enron scandal and collapse. It's the story of how a darling of Wall Street went from America's most innovative company in 1995 to complete demise in 2002, and even prosecution of its executives. It forced countries around the world, starting with the United States, to adopt new regulations in the fields of accountability and accounting, in ethics, in transparency, and in ultimate responsibility of board members. Because before that, there was no such thing as studying governance, and it was very difficult to define governance. But it took that one company to do what it did, and to have repercussions around the planet to actually get people to sit down and think about what is governance. And governance crises happen still today, and as far as we're concerned here in this room, on our boards. They happen often. I've been through it myself once or twice, and I'm sure it's happened to you. And if it hadn't, and it's because of that we're having this discussion this morning. It's because it is a problem, and it is a big elephant in this room. Alors, les 4 mots-clés de la gouvernance, c'est l'imputabilité, l'éthique, la transparence et la responsabilité. Personnellement, je pense que les musiciens ne devraient pas être des membres de conseil d'administration, et je vous explique pourquoi. Si, en tant que musicien, vous siégez ou voulez siéger à un conseil d'administration de votre orchestre, vous devez savoir clairement sur qui repose l'imputabilité des décisions qui sont prises ou qui ne sont pas prises et des gestes qui sont posés. Un membre de conseil d'administration est personnellement imputable de la santé financière et du bien-être de l'orchestre, c'est-à-dire son personnel, ses musiciens, et il est aussi imputable envers le public, envers les abonnés, envers les donateurs et envers les divers paliers de gouvernement qui sont des subventionneurs. Pour ce qui est de l'éthique, chaque conseil d'administration doit avoir une politique ou un code d'éthique et chaque membre doit le signer. Et cette politique couvre la confidentialité des dossiers. Alors, ce qui se dit autour de la table d'un conseil d'administration reste autour de la table d'un conseil d'administration. Ça, c'est une règle très importante en gouvernance. La transparence est aussi une condition sine qua non à l'établissement d'une relation de confiance entre les membres du conseil ainsi qu'avec les diverses parties prenantes, y compris la grande communauté. Responsibility is the overarching engagement of board members. I'm not familiar with all the laws around the world. In this country only, there are 14 jurisdictions and at least 11 laws covering not-for-profit organizations. So what is clear is that board members, like I said, are personally responsible if things go wrong, which is why boards pay some fairly hefty amounts for liability insurance. En résumé, le mandat d'un conseil d'administration en 2017 ne se limite pas à la défense des actionnaires ou des administrateurs, encore moins à la simple vérification des colonnes de chiffres et des calculs. Le conseil d'administration doit être le gardien de la réputation de l'entreprise ou de l'orchestre. Il doit agir comme un fiduciaire, et ça, encore, on en a parlé tantôt, un fiduciaire des relations avec toutes les parties prenantes et avoir l'indépendance nécessaire pour porter un jugement objectif sur la direction et sur les opérations. Ce qui nous amène à l'épineuse question de la représentation des employés ou, dans le cas qui nous concerne, des musiciens sur les conseils d'administration. C'est un débat qui ne cesse de s'inviter dans les discussions, comme en fait foi la rencontre de ce matin. On doit donc parler ici de l'indépendance des administrateurs. La loi canadienne stipule qu'un membre de conseil d'administration se qualifie comme indépendant s'il n'a pas de manière directe ou indirecte des relations ou des intérêts, par exemple de nature financière, commerciale, professionnelle ou philanthropique. Ça couvre beaucoup de terrain et qui sont susceptibles de nuire à la qualité des décisions eu égard aux intérêts de la société. C'est on ne peut plus clair. À la lumière de ces constats, les employés, donc les musiciens, sont des parties prenantes de l'entreprise qu'est l'orchestre. Ils n'ont pas l'indépendance requise ou recommandée. Les musiciens, pas plus que tout autre employé, ne peuvent être juges et parties. Et les musiciens ne peuvent pas être leurs propres fiduciaires. Canadian standard-setting organizations have given strict advice as it pertains to good governance and have employees on board and having employees on board. And a decision rendered by the Supreme Court of the state of Delaware in the United States this past January was strictly defines the notion of independence of board administrators, and it brings us to suggest that musicians should not be members of the board of their orchestra. All this being said, musicians should definitely be invited to board meetings and should participate on board committees, and not just artistic committees. I'm not a musician, but I know one thing, musicians can count. So why not have musicians sit on the audit committee? Why not sit on the strategic planning committee? Why not sit on the governance committee? I don't believe in pigeonholing people according to skills. You're an accountant, therefore you sit on the finance committee. You're a musician, therefore you sit on the artistic committee. I, as a manager, prefer working with the intelligence and with the interests of the people, whatever these horizons may be. Lately, the whole question, and lastly, this whole question begs another one as to why boards hesitate to bring employees to the board. And in some cases, they even don't want the CEO to sit on the board. I've seen that happen. The answer to that, well, is wide open, but it's safe to say that people in situations of control, or should I say on a power trip, and who do not rightly know what goes on in the orchestra on a daily basis, because it's simply not their job, don't like to have at the table other people who know more than they do. I leave it at that.
Very good. Well, I think that's great, because what we've got here is quite a cross-section of views on this issue. And let me put a scenario to you, Torbjørn. So you're on the board of your orchestra as a musician representative, and your colleagues in the orchestra are saying, you know, we haven't had a decent rise for a long time. You know, if we're going to keep up with the cost of living, we need to get a 5% increase. You go to your board meeting and you discuss the financial situation of the board. And it's very clear to you that under the current financial structures that your orchestra is running, 5% isn't affordable. Just simply isn't affordable. So you go back to your colleagues and you say, you know, I'd like 5%, just the same as you'd like 5%, but the money's not there. And your colleagues say, yeah, you know why the money's not there? It's because you're spending too much money on visiting soloists and conductors. That's what you need to change. Make those savings and you'll find the 5% for us. What do you do?
Very good question.
Thank you.
It's a good question, but not so easy to answer. And especially if you then sit with two hats, like you're also a negotiator for salaries in the orchestra. I've had, I'm a union representative, but we in our orchestra committee we split the negotiations about salaries and collective bargains to another committee. So at one time I had the responsibility for bargaining wages, and I said in that period I can't sit in the board. So that was a way to solve that problem. But back to your question, if the people that negotiate salaries come to me and say you have to convince the board or whatever, I can't do that. As I said, the board doesn't handle negotiations or anything like that. But of course, I see the numbers and I see the budget, and I can, in my knowledge, go back to our representative that negotiates and say that I'm sorry, but the next year it's not money for 5% raise, and I would hope that they would respect that. But then again, I can see that the budget has, openings for its other priorities, and that is, of course, the management's responsibility to do the priorities. But well, it's a tricky question. It is.
That's fine. It's fine. Pass the mic. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Thérèse?
I think that pertaining to specifically your question of changing, like we say in French, 4 sous pour une pièce.
And in English you say?
In English you say, 4 quarters for $1. Okay. It's, I think, bringing other soloists or whatever is really not the solution unless it becomes a collective decision to do things differently. If as an orchestra is in dire straits, there's only so much money, and we have patrons and we have people who want to come to the orchestra, and we have musicians who want to work and who want to learn, because musicians like challenges in the music that they play. I think it has to be a collective agreement to see where, if there's only so much money, where do we spend it over the next few years. And it cannot be something that musicians say, well, just hire less people or less expensive people, and the music company says, well, no raises this year. You're not going to get anywhere. You have to put on the table everything that requires dollars, and collectively decide how are we going to do this, while at the same time answering to the needs of the people who come to the concert, and at the same time making sure that musicians have fun and joy doing the work that they do every day.
Okay, let me ask you something else, and it's pertinent to your presentation. You made a very good argument for why musicians shouldn't be on the board. But the musicians, more than anyone, have the well-being of the orchestra at their heart. Their investment in the orchestra is greater than anybody else's. And so surely that puts them at the very heart of the decision-making process, because they're not going to make decisions that undermine the security of the orchestra, the future of the orchestra, or threaten it. They're going to be, as you quite rightly say, they're very resourceful, they're imaginative, and they are responsible. And so they, being the biggest stakeholders in this whole kind of stratosphere, surely they should be at the heart of the decision-making process.
I agree. But not all decisions are made on boards. And that's why I think that I talked in my presentation about board committees, but I neglected to talk about management committees. Mm-hmm. And it's a question of personality, it's a question of history, it's a question of how the orchestra has functioned, and it's a history also of the constitution of an orchestra, because some orchestras are co-ops, for example, so that the musicians are front row center, not only on stage but behind, because it's their company. But I think you have to use musicians on committees like any other employee of the orchestra, and like any board member, and even people from the community who come on an ad hoc basis to help with something. The problem is solved, we found a solution to something, and then they go on to other and better things. But I think that this whole idea of separating people or organizing people on a hierarchy of some sort is not going to get us anywhere. But maybe that's a reflection of my own way of doing things, of bringing around more consensus around the table than saying you do this and you do this and you do this, and then parts don't talk to each other.
Okay. Thank you. I want to ask Naomi specifically about the bargaining unit, because where do you draw the line? How do you make sure that the bargaining unit functions as well as it possibly can when you have got musicians sitting on the board?
Well, just to answer a little bit about the last question, I think we'll transition well. Yeah. I think your question about, what if the musicians want a 5% raise, and how does the musician representative to the board deal with that situation? And the answer is that that's not the appropriate role for the musician representative to the board, that they shouldn't be talking about wages. That's something that should be talked about in the context of collective bargaining with the union representative. And I think that's where you run into these issues about bargaining unit erosion, that if you have musicians who are serving on boards, they end up in these roles that make them more management than employee. If they're making fiduciary decisions, if they're sitting there and discussing, the budget, or how much money are we going to spend on this and how much money are we going to spend on that. If they're discussing a particular person, whether it be staff or a musician or manager or a board member, are they going to be continual employees of this organization? Are they going to be, continue to be involved in this organization? As soon as you ask musicians to make that kind of a decision, with the exception of the self-governing orchestras, of course, but if you're going to ask a musician to make that kind of a decision, then they're becoming managerial. And by law, that may be one way that they can be excluded from the bargaining unit if management wants to go that way. But the other thing I think that's important is that, going back to what I said before, it puts the musician in this really difficult position of having to sort of serve two masters. Yeah. And I think that can create a huge divide within the bargaining unit itself. If you have one musician, all the musicians are saying, hey, we really need this raise, and this musician's been sitting in board meetings and knows, there's no money. And they're going back to their colleagues and they're saying, oh, guys, there's no money. Then their colleagues are saying, this guy's brainwashed. Yeah. And so it creates this sort of, grumbling and divisiveness amongst the musicians, and solidarity and unity is so important. As our president said earlier yesterday, solidarity and unity is so important within the bargaining unit, and it would be a shame to have somebody whose purpose is to help grow the orchestra to be the one that sort of plants the seed of, disappointment and unrest.
Sure. So. Bongani, how much influence and in what areas do musicians have over your orchestras?
Yes. I just want to add on that 5% question.
Okay.
When you said, as our president said yesterday, I thought maybe we're talking about Trump.
Yeah.
For a second. Yes. But I want to go back to that question.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of things that we're grappling with will be much easier if musicians, management, and the board, and certain key stakeholders have really one vision and mission. And so that's why it's crucial that musicians participate in strategic meetings, in the vision and mission of orchestras. Because that question, it's a very good question. If musicians say, well, let's lower the standard of conductors or soloists. Now, if the vision of that orchestra is to be one of the best in Europe, for instance, and that will go against that vision. Yes, you can give musicians 5%, and you'll have a lower level of conductors and soloists. What does that do to our vision and mission if part of it is to attract recording contracts, etc., etc.? So if we're all in one thought and really believe in this, it makes all the other issues, including bargaining, easier because we all believe in this in the same way.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank you. That's been really interesting for me. I hope it's been interesting for you too. But no doubt there are some questions that have gone unanswered so far. So I'm going to put it to the floor now. Simon, I think you're first up.
I was quick off the mark.
You were.
Good morning. I'm Simon Collins. Come from the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra in Australia, and I'm also the national president of a trade union in Australia, which means I'm chairman of the board, which means that I'm pretty much responsible in the first instance for the governance of a large organisation. And governance is a fascinating subject, and it is with respect to orchestras. In Australia, virtually all of our major arts companies, some 32 of them around the country, are in fact corporate entities. So they are, under Australian law, they are nearly all actually companies limited by guarantee. We don't need to go into the details of the different structures of companies, but they are run by boards. And over the years, I've had quite a big interest in this because as the companies were set up, there was a strong view, particularly amongst the orchestra companies, which account for eight of those companies, that a musician should be on the board. Of course, the issues of conflict of interest immediately arise. I wanted to raise several points with respect to the different things that have been said. The first thing I'm going to say that is the discussion that occurred in each of those orchestras and watching it around the country with respect to the willingness of corporate professional board people to accept musicians on boards to some degree reflected the health or the culture of those organisations. Where the boards were willing to accept a musician as a board member, those orchestras tended to be the ones where we had the best internal culture, the most cooperative or collaborative approach to running those companies. Where boards were resistant, in one or two orchestras in particular, they were where the biggest problems were. The second issue I'd like to bring up is the question of representative. The word's been used by two or three of you this morning with respect to a musician being on the board as a representative. If we go to good governance, an organisation is run by a board in the sense that the board is responsible for governance, not managing. If you put management and the board together, straight away you create conflict. So the board needs to be a group of people who have the one sense of purpose of the best outcomes for this organisation, and that they then need to appoint managers and supervise managers and help them draw up budgets which deliver that mission. If the manager is not delivering, remove him and find somebody who does. If the musicians are not performing, remove them and find somebody who does. That's governance. It needs to be separated from management. So the premise of nearly all the questions that have been raised to test the model have basically implied that the musician who goes onto the board is a union rep. That's a disaster. You separate those functions. So with the Australian orchestras, a union rep is a union rep, and the board person, in fact, needs to be separate. And once they go onto the board, their one purpose is the good of the overall company, and they cannot argue as representative of musicians, because that would be a conflict.
Good.
It needs to be separate. So,
I'm going to put the clock on you in a minute, Simon.
oh, sorry, good governance. You need to separate the governance, and Thérèse has spoken very eloquently on the issues of governance, from management. Conflict of interest needs to be managed. There are conflicts everywhere. The most important thing is to identify it. And if it's going to be a problem, then you deal with it. And there are a range of ways you can deal with it, from observing that it's there, acknowledging it's there, to perhaps deciding you don't vote on this issue, or indeed not being on the board at all. It's a matter of conflict. A person who is sponsoring the orchestra with $1 million a year has a conflict. The CEO has a conflict. You can't have the organisation without a CEO, and you can't have the organisation without the donor. You need to identify the conflicts and deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. What I propose to do is to take a few questions or statements, as Simon just made, and then ask you to respond to them. Eileen, at the back of the hall next.
Thank you. Am I being heard? Yeah. Eileen Spencer, British Musicians Union. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of strategic direction, because this so easily the strategy can only be fulfilled by the actual musicians who are working in the orchestra. And this, I suppose, goes over into partly orchestral management, but I just feel that the strategy has to be aware of what it costs the musicians in personal effort to achieve the goals. I mean, if the strategy is to be more populist, and therefore to put in lots of concerts of a different nature, how does that affect the musicians? How does it affect their workload? Are some musicians going to have to work so hard that in fact they're going to become ill? I think the issues very often overlap, and I suppose in order to resolve these things, it's a matter of good communication. As Thérèse says, you would need committees that different people could sit on and feed through all the different issues. But orchestras are very, very hierarchical organisations, and it may well be that the ordinary musician who is under the stress of a probably excessive workload, certainly in England that's the case, that musician feels that they do not have a voice. They cannot say, please do not schedule so many very, very heavy works all at once and expect us to do everything. So how far can strategy reflect a decent working life for the musicians, and how can the musicians have a say? I think in many English orchestras, there's a feeling that we just don't have a say. So it would be very good to hear about places where this happens properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Eileen. I'll take one more from the gentleman at the front, and then I'll ask the panellists to comment, and we'll have a little break, and I'll take the other three.
¿Sí? Buenos días. Yo voy a hablar en mi idioma español. Yo vengo de Uruguay, soy músico de la Orquesta Filarmónica de Montevideo y también secretario general del Sindicato de Músicos.
Sorry, could you pause for 1 second? I'm not getting a translation at the moment.
Los españoles. What happened with Spanish? What happened with Spanish? You know?
My French is awful. My Spanish is non-existent, so I can't help.
No, ¿cómo decir?
How is your Zulu?
Oh dear, about as good as my Spanish. All right.
No, pero él puede decir. He can do that very well.
Okay. Are we going to have a? We're going to have a live translation. Yeah.
Ahí.
¿Puedes repetirlo?
Sí.
Okay. Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but start again if you would. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Sergio Navata.
My name is Sergio Navarra.
Yo,
It's back on.
it's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Mi nombre es Sergio Navata, vengo de la Orquesta Filarmónica de Montevideo, Uruguay. Quiero hacer un breve comentario y una pregunta concreta sobre este tema que es muy interesante y bastante polémico. También en mi orquesta existe un consejo o un directorio que está integrado por músicos. 2 delegados de nuestra orquesta forman parte de este directorio de 5 miembros, que hasta ahora ha funcionado muy bien. Pero el tema principal, me parece además, que depende del modelo que se elija en cada lugar y depende de la realidad de cada lugar. Entonces, en ese sentido, si se definen bien los perfiles o los cargos o las funciones y las competencias que tiene cada consejo, eso puede funcionar o puede tener conflicto. Lo que estoy viendo en este momento es también varias experiencias, algunas buenas tal vez y otras no tanto, con músicos integrados al directorio, porque se generan conflictos cuando se discuten temas que no deberían estar de repente en ese directorio. En nuestro ejemplo, eso no ocurre porque los rubros son distintos y existen 3 rubros fundamentales que son los gastos de funcionamiento, inversiones y remuneraciones personales, que son salarios que no se pueden mezclar ni se pueden transferir uno a otro. Por lo cual, no tiene ningún sentido discutir dentro del directorio salario porque no se puede sacar dinero de un rubro, ahorrar, por ejemplo, en contratación de solistas o directores para pagar más salario. Eso es imposible. Entonces, de ese punto de vista, nuestro sistema ha funcionado muy bien. La pregunta que yo quería hacer concreta y principalmente a Eide de Noruega es algunos resultados concretos, porque yo no sé desde cuándo existe este consejo integrado por músicos y qué resultados concretos ha habido desde que estos músicos están integrados en beneficio común de la institución, o sea, de la orquesta a la cual le pertenece, y si puede haber una comparación con anterioridad a que los músicos formaron parte del directorio. Gracias.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask the panelists to succinctly comment on what you've heard so far, and who would like to go first? Torbjørn.
I can go first since he directed the question to me. I can't say what the board was like before the musicians were represented, because that's maybe from 1765. But so in modern time, the musicians in all of the Norwegian orchestra has been represented. It's interesting to say that the musician members of the orchestra boards are not representatives. That's an interesting perspective, because they have the responsibility for the good of the whole orchestra and the whole organization, and that's a good point. And I always feel that the board would be, in our board at least, they would be very disappointed and feel that they were working in a kind of vacuum if they didn't have our voice. Because to have the musician's perspective is very important for the board, and they're asking for it all the time. In every board meeting, they have the perspective of the CEO, the manager, and they always ask, what do you think? What's the musician's perspective on this topic? And so it works very well. It's smooth, and it's very, very seldom conflicts. And so the storytelling is important. I have an example. We were on strike in 2006. And I was in the board at that time also. And they were interesting to hear, you know, from our perspective. And we had board meetings during the strike as well. I was thinking maybe that's not legal, but but we had. And from our point of view, it was a good thing. And also, just recently, we have been organizing our pension way of paying pension for the musicians, and the management had a paper presented for the board, their views of why we should change, and what we should change to. And luckily, the papers for the board they came in good time before, maybe a week or so, and we were able to also give our point of view in a paper. So, you know, if it only was from the management, you know, the board would have a wrong perspective on things. So, yeah. So, and the board doesn't have committees. The board is the board, and the orchestra has a lot of committees. Yeah. With active musicians. So, yeah.
Thank you, Torbjørn. I'm going to bring Naomi in a second. I just wanted to refresh. Simon made some very good comments about, you know, the difference in the roles of the management and the board, and also the conflict of interest that is inevitable in a lot of cases in all these roles. And Eileen also, I thought, made a good point about, you know, the strategy that the board arrives at has to take into consideration, you know, the workload and the well-being of the musicians. So anyway, Naomi.
I actually wanted to address what Simon had said about. He said two things. First, he said that the most successful orchestras in Australia, and please correct me if I'm paraphrasing you wrong, but he said the most successful orchestras in Australia are the ones that set up their governance to include musicians. And then he said that musicians who serve on the board do not fulfill the role of musician representative. Well, I would ask, what role do they serve? Because the whole point of having musicians participate in board activity is to have that shared perspective, right? To say, so the board knows what the musician's perspective is, and so that the musicians know what the board's perspective is, and so they can begin to build bridges of communication to grow the strategic plan of the orchestra, to grow the orchestra together. And it's what we've seen in ROPA orchestras across the United States, is that the orchestras where the musicians and the board members have good relationships, and not just at the board table or at the concerts, but, you know, good working relationships, that they're able to call each other and say, we have a problem, how do we solve it? Those are the orchestras that are most successful. But I have one caveat to that, which is that also, it's extremely important that the musician who fills that role, the one who picks up the phone and calls the board member, understands their duty to represent the musicians and understands those conflicts so that they can appropriately deal with the issues and respond and create this relationship without sort of undermining the labor management structure.
Thank you, Naomi. Thérèse.
I would add to that, I think we have here a question of legalities, and of course the laws differ from one country to the other, and I think we have a question of semantics. And I think it's when you have no board should have representatives. So a person on the board should not represent donors or should not represent government or should not represent a major company that's sponsoring a concert. It's not the job of that is not good governance. It may be legal, but it's not good governance, and it's not because something is not illegal that it's good governance. So yeah, I think you have to separate that, and good governance is means that the people who sit on the board are on the board because they have the interest of the orchestra at heart, whether they be lawyers or teachers or musicians. It doesn't make any difference. People are there to do a job. They are a fiduciary. They have a legal responsibility, and they do not represent anybody. And I think that's the semantics of it. You have to. It doesn't mean that you don't want a musician to sit on your committees, that you don't want a union representative, maybe. That you have to make that difference, I think.
But there's a tension there, because often the musician on the board has been put there by his colleagues or her colleagues. Yes. And they've done that for a very, for one obvious reason. That they think this person will, is well informed, is going to make the right decisions for the orchestra, and going to put their point strongly. And so, there's a conflict there between the process which puts that board member on the board and the role that you say that they should be fulfilling.
Because the person is not, in my opinion, should not be a member of the board, so that if they come to the board, it's because they've been invited to come and say something. So if what they bring is their own idea or the idea of their colleagues or the idea of colleagues from another country, they're there to share stories or to share ideas or to elevate the discussion above, platitudes. But they are not members of the board. That's from my point of view.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And I'd like to answer the question of Eileen was her name?
Eileen, yeah.
I think if orchestras start doing all sorts of repertoire, and it's against their mission, because I think here Bongani made a very good point at following your mission and your vision. I think you have to take that into consideration on orchestras. And I have personally been in a situation in an orchestra where people on the board wanted to change the whole way that musicians played and the whole repertoire just to bring more people in the halls. I mean, they understood absolutely nothing of what was at stake here. And so I think that's very important. It's to, there's a mission, and you stick to that mission. And if in your vision and in the ways to realize your mission, once in a while you do this sort of repertoire, whether it be ballet or pop music or whatever, then it's understood that it's once in a while. But if you're going to change the entire thing, change the orchestra, change the music, the mission.
Change the board. I want to bring, I know Deborah and Anders were standing before, so I'll do 3 more questions from the floor, and then I'll go to the panel again. Deborah, the mic is yours.
Good morning. It's difficult to say that we are asking to be part of the board or the management. From my point of view, my own point of view, we want to be part of the decision making. This is what we really request, and it can be the participation of the musicians can be in different aspects, levels, grade of responsibility, and time of engagement, because we do want to play also. We don't want to quit playing because we want to be part of the decision making. So it works differently also in different countries, different orchestras in the same city. They have different ways of thinking, but I think that everywhere the musicians really want to be heard, and sometimes to be heard we must participate, because nobody is coming to, oh, what do you want to say? It's not exactly how it works. So sometimes when we see the resistance from, I don't know, the board, or it depends on the structure of the orchestra, the resistance not having the musicians participating by saying, oh, you don't have to, just play, you do it so beautifully, we don't want to bother you with all these problems, I can administrate that because this is my business. It sounds like, well, we might decide something that musicians don't like, so don't bother coming here and being part of it, because it might be uncomfortable when a musician is on the board and has to decide about raise or not raise in our wages, or a strike or a not strike. Might be uncomfortable, but we're not looking for comfort, really, because we are dealing with conflicts. We are just looking for a good condition to deal with it. It's not comfort. And it's not going to be an easy task. Nobody's expecting that. And we'll have to model it all the time. It depends on the situation, it depends on the structure, it depends on the city, it depends on the weather, it depends on so many things, you know. And but what I think it's that we do have to participate and take risks, yes, because musicians are there taking risks anyway. If we decide or if we don't decide, and the worst risk that we might be under is the ones that we don't decide for them. I think this is even worse. So I believe in participation, and most of orchestras in Brazil, they were created by musicians. And after a while, okay, we have to hire some people to manage it because we can't do everything. And then all of a sudden, there's a culpa, and the musicians are in a lower level of the hierarchy of decisions, and this is not fair. Even in the public orchestras, the musicians created in the orchestra, and they brought in the state or the city to put money and run it somehow. But still, we create it, we think it, we organize it, and then we just give it away. It's our fault too. But I think it's not too late to get it back. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Anders.
I see there's a warning from our friend there.
Yes.
First, I will declare that I agree with everybody.
We actually had one substitution on the panel, so as a referee, I can add on a couple of minutes for that.
Will that referee have a whistle? Would that referee have a whistle? No, maybe that's one thing I disagree about. That was Deborah now included the weather, but maybe she's true. She's right. There's something about the weather. No, I talk from Danish experiences, and sometimes actually we have among musicians, or we have specific musicians that have experiences from other parts of their life in communication, fundraising, economic overview, or whatever. And sometimes these skills are of such a quality that these persons could be included in the board, because an orchestra is in deep crisis. We call it in Denmark in deep shit. So we have to include them whichsoever what reason. So therefore, you never know. Therefore, I don't think there is a truth in this. Maybe you could say there are different situations in different countries, in different orchestras, in different kind of weather, as Deborah stated. And in Bergen, in Norway, you are known to have very bad weather. So maybe that's why it's the weather. But I have to say that there should be a lot more love in this. And Robert from Jacksonville in Florida yesterday, manager of that orchestra, stated that he actually found it very important to not to forget that we love the musicians, we include the musicians in whichever. So, Thérèse Boutin, I will say to you, I agree with you, but we should take care that semantics or semantic analysis don't kill us, that legal obstacles don't kill us. Because if we always talk that language, we can keep anyone out of the board, and maybe that's not the best for the orchestra. These things are not black and white. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Be patient with me. I'm going to take the gentleman at the back of the hall first. Thank you.
Jean-Luc Gagnon, je suis trompettiste à l'Orchestre symphonique de Montréal. Je vais vous laisser le temps de... OK. Alors, je suis trompettiste à l'Orchestre symphonique de Montréal depuis 30 ans. J'ai passé l'essentiel de ma carrière impliqué dans les comités. J'ai été président du comité. Je suis aussi membre du conseil d'administration au local 406, ici à Montréal, depuis 15 ans. Et aussi été représentant des musiciens.
Sorry, you're going to have to pause again.
Okay.
Got a delay with the translation again. Okay now? Right. Start again, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
Alors, comme je disais, j'ai été impliqué presque toute ma carrière dans les comités des musiciens à l'Orchestre symphonique de Montréal, membre du conseil d'administration au local 406, représentant des musiciens au conseil d'administration pendant plusieurs années et souvent en conflit d'intérêts, mais tout le monde le savait. Pendant la longue grève de l'OSM en 2005, j'étais président du comité des musiciens et représentant au conseil d'administration. Je n'étais pas au comité de négociation de la dernière négo, mais j'étais là durant la grève de 2005, la longue grève de 5 mois à l'OSM. Dans ma présence au conseil d'administration, ce que j'ai réalisé, ce que je voulais faire surtout, c'était d'essayer de faire un peu d'éducation sur les musiciens et envers le conseil d'administration. Ce n'est pas toujours évident, ça prend beaucoup de bravoure pour aller siéger au conseil d'administration, surtout quand ton président de conseil d'administration est ton ex-premier ministre de la province de Québec. Au conseil d'administration, il y a beaucoup d'avocats, il y a beaucoup de richesses, mais ce que j'ai réalisé, en voulant faire un peu d'éducation, c'est que les membres des conseils d'administration, et de là l'importance peut-être du manque de communication, c'est que j'ai réalisé que la plupart des membres du conseil d'administration n'ont aucune idée de ce qui se passe sur la scène. Les musiciens ont fait des concerts, mais quand on commence à parler des instruments, quand on commence à parler du nombre d'heures qu'un hautboïste passe à faire ses hanches, du nombre d'heures de pratique qu'on doit faire à la maison, j'ai réalisé qu'il y avait un manque profond de la connaissance de notre milieu. Et ce que je pense qui est manquant dans notre domaine, c'est que la plupart des gens du conseil d'administration n'ont pas la connaissance approfondie de qu'est-ce qu'un orchestre symphonique, autre que de donner des concerts, comment ça fonctionne un orchestre symphonique. Alors moi, j'ai voulu faire un peu d'éducation, puis j'ai réalisé que, surtout, on a monté un projet sur la valeur des instruments que les musiciens amenaient à l'orchestre. Et les gens du conseil d'administration n'avaient aucune idée de la valeur en instruments que les musiciens amenaient de leur poche à l'orchestre. Je ne sais pas comment ça fonctionne dans les autres orchestres à travers le monde, mais ici à Montréal, on paie nos instruments de musique. Ça, c'est une chose. Lors de la dernière grève en 2005, ce qui est extrêmement difficile aussi, c'est de se faire dire qu'on vous paie pour 20 heures par semaine. Vous avez dû peut-être l'entendre dans vos différentes grèves. Le travail du musicien n'est pas reconnu. Et ce que je trouve un peu déplorable, c'est le manque de connaissance au conseil d'administration de qu'est-ce qu'est vraiment un orchestre symphonique. Et là est pour moi le grand problème. Aussi, quand je suis entré, on a parlé de règles d'éthique tantôt pour Mme Boutin. On a parlé de règles d'éthique dans les conseils d'administration. Quand je suis entré comme représentant des musiciens au conseil d'administration de l'OSM, j'ai demandé est-ce qu'il y a des règles d'éthique, un code à respecter, confidentialité? Je n'ai jamais eu de réponse. Alors, c'est un peu déplorable parce qu'on connaissait mal nos rôles et on ne sait jamais trop quoi dire, quoi pas dire, qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire à l'extérieur du conseil d'administration et jusqu'où il y a la confidentialité. Alors, ce que je réalisais, c'est que c'était surtout un acte social en tant que musicien d'aller prendre un lunch avec les gens du conseil d'administration et que finalement, il manquait beaucoup de transparence. Alors, le rôle des musiciens au sein du conseil d'administration, c'est OK, mais il faudrait peut-être que les conseils d'administration soient plus au courant de la façon qu'un orchestre symphonique fonctionne. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, and can I ask the last two speakers to be as succinct as possible, please? Yeah. Thank you.
Donc en français, je pense que vous avez présenté un monde idéal, une espèce de Walt Disney orchestral, mais malheureusement la réalité est beaucoup moins facile dans certains endroits. Je viens d'un pays où le dialogue social n'est pas simple et où la place des salariés, et notamment des musiciens, n'est pas toujours reconnue. Je pense que c'est facile, je pense que ça arrive souvent, qu'on souhaite faire le bonheur des gens malgré eux. Mais je pense que ça arrive aussi très régulièrement qu'on fasse le malheur des gens malgré eux. Et dans ce genre de situation, on regrette que les personnes qui sont victimes de mauvaise gestion, d'erreurs de gestion, d'erreurs d'orientation, n'aient pas eu la possibilité d'être entendues au moment où les choses se faisaient. J'ai un exemple très précis en France d'un orchestre et opéra, puisque cet orchestre fait à la fois le symphonique et le lyrique, où il y a eu une gestion qui a amené à des dépenses phénoménales par rapport à des projets qui étaient des projets extrêmement prestigieux, où on a invité des scénographes, qu'on a invité des solistes pour des prix absolument extraordinaires, irresponsables, où les musiciens n'ont cessé de dénoncer cette situation et où ils n'avaient aucune place dans le cadre de la gestion de l'orchestre pour pouvoir dire publiquement ce qu'ils pensaient de cette situation. Là, le résultat de ça, c'est que cet orchestre aujourd'hui a fait l'objet d'un rapport de la Cour des comptes, qui est une instance en France où la légalité est analysée par des gens extérieurs et où ce rapport dénonce la gestion et où on va se retrouver avec un plan de licenciement des musiciens. Parce que, en réalité, moi je ne pense pas, je vais peut-être être moins consensuel que beaucoup ici, mais je ne pense pas qu'il y a une seule gestion. Je ne pense pas qu'il y a la bonne gestion et la mauvaise gestion. Je pense qu'il y a des orientations dans la gestion et qu'il peut y avoir des divergences de point de vue sur les priorités à mettre et que ces divergences de point de vue, parfois, seuls les musiciens sont en capacité de pouvoir énoncer un certain nombre de principes. Par exemple, il y a le vote qui a été fait par cette structure d'indemnité de départ à la retraite d'un administrateur qui s'est monté en milliers, en centaines de milliers d'euros, alors qu'on disait aux musiciens qu'il n'y avait pas d'argent pour éventuellement des augmentations de salaire. Et que cette contradiction, ça fait partie de la vie. Les rapports de force, ils font partie de la vie. Et moi, ça ne me dérange pas que dans un conseil d'administration, il puisse y avoir du conflit. Je trouve que ça fait partie de la vie, le conflit. Et qu'à partir du moment où on accepte ce principe-là, à ce moment-là, je pense que la présence de contre-pouvoir, la présence de gens qui représentent peut-être des intérêts divergents, oui, peut-être des points de vue divergents, ça crée une dialectique et que de cette dialectique peut sortir quelque chose de positif. Mais imaginez que les musiciens, s'ils sont dans un conseil d'administration, portent forcément la voix irresponsable et que les gestionnaires portent forcément la voix responsable, je pense que ce n'est pas tout à fait juste. Parce que les principales victimes, à la fin du compte, lorsqu'il y a une mauvaise gestion, c'est les musiciens.
Our last speaker from the floor, at the back.
Oui, bonjour. Benoît Cormier, violoniste à l'Orchestre symphonique de Québec. Rapidement, en fait, mon commentaire serait à l'effet que les liens étroits entre les musiciens et les conseils d'administration sont, à mes yeux, primordiaux. Je suis le premier à reconnaître l'importance de la saine gouvernance et de la transparence et du respect des règles d'éthique. Cependant, il faut trouver des façons de continuer à cultiver les liens entre les musiciens et les administrateurs, parce que je pense que je rejoins mon collègue Jean-Luc de Montréal, mon prédécesseur. Je pense que c'est la seule façon, en fait, d'éduquer. Je ne sais pas si c'est une réalité très canadienne, mais d'éduquer les membres des conseils d'administration aux bases de notre métier, de notre mission même. Puis c'est une façon de s'assurer que la mission soit poursuivie dans le bon sens. Et en ce sens, je pense que les musiciens doivent trouver des façons de cultiver des liens étroits sur une base continue. Moi-même, je suis membre non votant au conseil d'administration depuis plus de 10 ans. Puis je pense que s'il y avait personne qui représentait les musiciens, ça pourrait même nuire à la survie même de notre organisation. Donc c'est primordial. Puis je pense qu'il faut faire confiance à l'intelligence des musiciens pour différencier les revendications et la sensibilisation. Merci.
I hope my colleagues heard that, because I was really struggling with my device here, I'm afraid. But okay, I want to bring this in on time. So literally 20 seconds from each of you, starting with Torbjørn.
It has been a very interesting discussion, this. And I must honestly say that when I was assigned to this panel, I thought, is there a problem with musicians being represented in the boards?
Now you see
I can see it is.
Yeah. That's fine. Pass the mic.
But again, the culture in Norwegian, I would say Scandinavian orchestras, is that the relationship between ordinary board members, if you should say that, and the musicians board members are very good and fruitful. So, in my perspective, it's if you know how to balance your union task with board work, it should be fine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thérèse.
I understand that I was very much on the theoretical part of all of this, and that was my job. And I think it's very important to be able to understand what the legal implications are, and to understand that everybody speaks the same language, so to speak, and so that we know where we're going, all of us here. But I think what it all comes down to is that we are all human beings who love music. We love to listen to music. We love to play an instrument. And it all comes down to, are we able to work together? I think Benoit had it right on. We have to work together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, I was encouraged hearing that even in Scandinavia there are orchestral strikes. So Deborah said all musicians want is to be part of decision making. And I'll use this phrase, all musicians want is to influence decision making. And earlier on, Horace asked me, well, can you cite some examples where it works well if a musician is in the board. And my experience has been that if a musician, whether you call it a representative or not, really have got a good relationship with management and they come to the board with one mind, that tends to be very successful. The board has got no chance. If management and musicians come to the board and say, look, we think this is the right way, it's very difficult for the board to go otherwise. So I'll say, if you go with the option of a musician in the orchestra, the musicians must be very careful who they choose. Unfortunately, often they don't always choose the best musician to sit there. They just choose a musician that they think is going to give them hell on the board.
Yes.
And that does not always help. And if you choose the other option of not having a musician on the board, as Thérèse was saying, then find other avenues such that the company can benefit from the council and the input and the involvement of musicians.
Well done. Yeah, thank you. And finally, Naomi.
I heard a lot of you out there speak about musicians educating board members about what it means to be a musician and what our lifestyles are like. And I think it's unfortunate but true that there are many, many board members, at least in the United States, who serve on boards because they want something to put on their resume and not necessarily because they care very much about the future of the orchestra. So I think that musicians ought to work hard to develop those relationships, but it's not our responsibility to correct poor stewardship. And all we can do is play wonderful music and try and involve all the constituents and everyone who comes to the concerts and everyone who supports the orchestra as much as we can in what we do in a more informal way so that those gaps can be bridged and build better relationships in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, there's nothing more for me to do other than to thank Naomi Bongani, Thérèse and Torbjørn for their fantastic contributions and to thank you for your contributions as well. Thank you.